Okay, well, it's now 4:00. One of our panellists is having a little bit of difficulty getting onto the main screen, but hopefully he'll be able to join us very soon. So welcome to the Arable Conversation session for Sustainable Rotation of Soils, Integrating Legumes, Cover Crops and Cash Crops. So I'm expecting we're going to cover lots of areas in this next hour. It's a good follow-on from the IPM session that was earlier on this afternoon. So just some quick housekeeping. The session will be recorded, and if you could use the general chat for just conversations between yourselves. If you'd like to post some questions for the panel, then please type them into the questions and answer session. And we'll try and pick up as many of those as we can. And you please post as many as you like. I was hoping we were going to get also Andrew Christie to fish through some of the questions and answers for us, but I'm not sure he's come into the session yet. So at the end of the session, there'll be a feedback form, and I'll post that into the general chat now because I'll probably forget at the end. Pete's appeared. And that allows you to feedback on the Arable Scotland event and get basis and points as well. So now Pete's arrived, I'll introduce the panel. I'm very pleased to have them all with us today. They've got a wide range of expertise. And I'll start off by I'll just go around the board. So we've got Christine Watson, Professor for Agricultural Systems from SRUC. Her interests focus on nutrient management in agricultural systems. We've got Dick Neale, who's Technical Manager for Hutchinsons Crop Protection and has expertise in soil weed management and cover crops. We've got Ed Brown, also from Hutchinsons, who's Head of Agroecology and also has a lot of interest in cover crops range. And then also from SRUC, we've got Paul Hargreaves, who's a soil scientist specialising in grasslands and forages. And then Pete from James Hutton Institute, who has an interest in sustainable systems and particularly an interest in legumes. So what I'll do is I'll just go around the board, and if each of our panel members could have a few minutes just telling us a bit more about themselves and just a couple of introduction sentences of what they think about this topic area. So if we start with Dick Neale, since he's at the top left of my screen.
Thanks, Tracy. Hi, I'm Dick Neale. I'm Technical Manager for Hutchinsons, a business I've been with for 25 years this year. In fact, it's 25 years last year. We lost a year somewhere along the line, I seem to think. My role has, obviously many of you will know me as my role at Brampton, researching blackgrass. Out of that research really came the question around soil management. If we needed to manage soil differently, particularly heavy soils, for controlling blackgrass, how would soils react to that management change? Would we be able to live with that change? And what could we do to soils to enable us to manage them for blackgrass control? And we saw at a very early stage that actually these heavy soils improved quite significantly from changing their management from deep tillage into a much more appropriate tillage system. Sometimes that was moving a bit more soil, but often it was moving a lot less. Utilisation of cover crops to support soil structure, nutrient cycling, etc., and it just sort of snowballed from there. Obviously, the interest has grown within the industry around how we improve our soil health in general. So my job has very much switched into weed control along with soil health, use of cover crops, and increasingly my role is taking each of these individual bits of technology out to growers and making sure that they implement the whole system correctly rather than just change their drill or stop ploughing and go to very shallow tillage is if they're going to do that, what are the impacts? And I sort of talk them through that scenario and how to make the best job of it and avoid the bear traps, of which there are many. So that's my job now, in a nutshell.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Dick. And we'll go to Paul now.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Tracy, for introducing me before. But just to say, my name's Paul Hargreaves. I'm from SRUC, and I work down at the Dairy Research and Innovation Centre down in Dumfries. I was introduced with grassland and forage, and we do have whole crop and maize grown on the farm, amongst other crops for the forage for the dairy cows, because they're mainly housed and then fed indoors. So the silage and the mixture of feed is really important. But my main background is in soils, and this is something that I've been looking at soil compaction and the effects on yield and yield quality, and also then trying to think of ways of getting round compaction problems, especially in grassland, moving to more of a controlled traffic system. However, I've also been involved with, as Dick said, this kind of concept of soil quality and soil health, and looking at a more holistic way of looking at the soil, not just the chemical inputs, but the physical aspects, and also how that affects the soil biology. So I've been doing some work with looking at earthworms as indicators of soil biology as well. And finally, we've been looking at introducing more legume systems into the forages to try and improve and increase the amount of protein that's grown on the farm, to be less reliant on imported protein. So hopefully some of those subjects may come up today.
Thanks, Paul. That's great. I'm particularly interested in the sort of the indicators and this understanding of how we know where we are in these systems. So we'll pass on to Christine now.
Thanks, Tracy. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Christine Watson. I'm based in SRUC up at Aberdeen. I have a background in soil science. I guess I started off with an interest in nitrogen cycling, which diversified to phosphorus cycling, which diversified to being interested in micronutrients as well. And what really interests me is the way that plants and soils interact, but also with livestock. So I've worked in a whole range of systems across arable and agroforestry, and even going as far as integrating pigs into arable rotations and the impacts that has on soils and nutrient cycling. I've also spent a fair bit of time working in both organic farming and conventional farming systems. And I think that gives me a desire to sort of understand more about how we can manage the system through using different crops, and the idea that what goes on below ground is as important as what goes on above ground, so that if we have a diversity of crop species, we have a diversity of root systems, and therefore a diversity of habitats for below ground activity. And that links across to what Paul was just saying about an interest in soil health, and how we can improve soil health through the ways in which we select plants for cropping systems and do things like develop mixtures and crop rotations. And that's probably enough for now, Tracy.
Thank you very much, Chrissy. It's an interesting point you brought up about the animals within the systems as well. There's certainly been an increase in discussions about mixing things up a little bit more than there have been sort of from 20 years ago. So Ed, would you like to have your few minutes?
Yeah, thank you, Tracy, and good afternoon, everybody. So my name's Ed Brown. I work also for Hutchinsons. I've been with them for 6 years. Initially trained conventionally in agronomy, working on a number of combinable crops, veg crops, and I guess you could say caught the soil bug 4 or 5 years ago, and have piled headfirst into all things soil health and agroecology, or regenerative agriculture, however you like to refer to it. And I am now head of agroecology for Hutchinsons. So my sort of role now is centered around not only helping to farmers to practically implement agroecology on farm, but also now to help our own agronomists deliver that service to their clients as well. So clearly that has a massive focus on all things soil health, looking at rotations, definitely implementing cover crops, and basically taking those principles of agroecology and trying to practically implement them on farm. And that applies to cereal growers, veg growers. I work with vineyards, all sorts of different crops. So yeah, I think that's enough from me for now.
There's quite a wide range of crops then you've worked on over the years.
Yeah, well, all crops grow in soil. So soil health, well, most crops grow in soil. Some of them are on tabletops, hydroponics. So yeah, but most crops grow in soil of some kind. So those basic principles of good soil management apply to a huge range of crops.
Yeah, very much so. It's interesting you say all plants grow in soil, considering the Hutton's new association with a lot of the vertical farming systems that are coming online. So we'll go to Pete now then.
Right, thanks, Tracy, and good afternoon, everyone. Keeping on the agroecological theme that Ed's just touched upon, I consider myself an agroecologist. I'm based at the James Hutton Institute, actually in the same office as Tracy for a long part of my career. But I did my PhD around 30 years ago on the regulation of nitrogen fixation by legumes, and spent a lot, certainly my early career, waiting for the West to wake up to legumes. Most of my PhD was spent working with people from Africa and South America and Australia and places like that. So, with respect to today's discussion, I'm particularly interested in legume-supported systems. I spend a lot of my time looking at everything all the way through from soil function, particularly to do with rhizobia and those things that can empower forage and grain legumes, all the way through to looking for novel products and novel supply chains. But certainly with respect to cover crops, I'm very excited about the potential that they can offer. It's great to see how well I think they've been taken up. I'd like to see them taken up even more. I think the potential that they can offer to the grain legumes to help support grain legume production in particular is huge. So, I'm just bowled over by their multifunctionality, their potential to improve soil function, deliver diversification, integrated pest management, lower inputs, and they're just one of those options for natural solutions, really. So I'll leave that there for now. I'm happy to take this forward, get the discussion going. Tracy, don't forget to introduce yourself, of course.
Okay, well, I'm Tracy Valentine, as Pete mentioned, and I call myself a plant soil person because my background is in plants and roots, but in the last probably 10-15 years, I've been very much working in the soil plants interactions area of work. We seem to have lost a couple of people. Dick and Ed have dropped out. Hopefully they'll get back on. So while we're waiting for them to hopefully reappear, I thought we'd start with in some ways it's a very simple question, but obviously will come from lots of different directions. And the question is, what would you regard as a sustainable management system? And in the context of the systems that you particularly work in, how would you know that you'd got there? So since Paul's now at the top of my screen, we'll start with Paul.
I thought it might be, and
sorry about that, Paul.
Let's start with one of the easy questions. Sustainable systems are something that should be thought about and tried to move towards. In the dairying world. There's obviously, it depends on how intensely you're feeding and trying to produce your milk there, and how many concentrates you're using, and what you import into the farm and what you grow on the farm. And down at the Dairy Research Centre, they've looked at different aspects of this in the past, either trying to feed a part of the herd or a subset of the herd that's had everything that's been byproducts or stuff that's already been used for something and then bought into the farm, so there's no actual land needed at all. And then the other side of that was looking at trying to grow everything on farm. So these sustainability issues are interesting, and the more, I would say personally, the more you can produce the feed on farm, the better. The more you can utilise what's sometimes classed as a waste product from the dairy industry, the slurry, use that more precisely, putting it onto crops and use it more as the fertiliser side of it. I think it's important to incorporate that into the system, and also what we're starting to look at now is to grow more protein on farm, again using this word sustainably, so we can rely on that protein source for the animals, so you can reduce the amount of imported and bought, especially soya and soya products, because supply issues with that, and also I think consumers and processors' attitude that's seen as somehow detrimental. So try and rely on more homegrown protein. How you get there, or what do you know when you get there? I think that's a very difficult question, really. I think you could say, if you can grow everything on farm and feed everything and get a decent supply of milk there that you're happy with, of a good quality, then you've more or less succeeded. But I think other things are going to change, and there's always new challenges with farming, and especially with climate change and the moving beyond trying to stop that, but trying to live with it. Then the potential there's more novel crops at the moment coming through that could be more of the industry standard in 10, 15 years time. So it's trying to incorporate those kind of things into your system as well as new things come out. So hopefully that's a bit of an insight, but I don't think I'm going to in 5 minutes going to be able to solve that problem entirely.
That's great, and it's interesting the point you talk about of trying to grow as much on farm as possible. A lot of the discussions that we've had quite recently have been about different people working together, so straw going from one farm to another and other products going the other way. So at this point I'm going to bring Pete in because of his interest in supply chains.
Yeah, I'm going to avoid your question initially, Tracy.
What a surprise.
In that, spinning on from what Paul said, I think it's really important that, of course, that people monitor the systems, but what a person regards as sustainability, depends on the individual concerned. A farmer might be looking for economic sustainability, but of course, what we're hoping is that as we move forward, that we're going to have that best marriage of economic and environmental sustainability. And so I'm certainly interested in management systems that are capable of doing that. I know that, for example, SRUC have the AgriCalc tool. There's other tools out there, such as the Cool Farm tool. Leaf has a tool. There's a number of interesting tools emerging. Some people are even using life cycle analysis. I think the bottom line is it's good to monitor your system and to have a tool to monitor it, whatever that tool is. If you're not monitoring your system, how can you know which direction you're traveling in? That's something I would emphasize. It is a surprise to me how many people might not be monitoring the system. And if you were to monitor anything, soil function is the best place. I would argue is the best place to start. So there are many indicators that you can use. But soil functional indicators, a great start. Paul, I think, mentioned earlier the utility of earthworms, as a proxy indicator of function. That's only one of many. Now, with regard to the value chain, yeah, it's interesting, particularly the push for more sustainable and circular protein supplies. I think the consumers are becoming ever more discerning about the products that they're choosing, and the people who are selling those products, various stores and whatnot, they're being very careful with what they want to stock. They want to have, authentic, sustainable products. So personally, I welcome that, but it is a challenge for the farmer, particularly if soybean is arriving in large quantities portside, quite cheap, as animal feed. So that's what you're up against. So, green has to be also commercially competitive. But certainly from the numbers I've seen, that can be achieved. And that boils down to, I think, obviously competition outside the farm gate, making it attractive for farmers to route their products to particular value chains. But efficient best practice operations on the farm are key. So maybe I'll scoop the question over to Hutchinsons. Ultimately it's about the farmers are making an investment, whether it's in legume crops or cereal crops or cover crops. But you want them to crop them as well as they can. I know from our conversations with PGRO that there are some growers out there that consistently grow crops well, very efficiently. I think there's often lessons to be learned by from these leader farmers.
Yeah, very much so. Just for the benefit of Ed and Dick, now you've managed to get your connection, is we started off with the question is what would you regard as sustainable management system in the systems that you work in or the context you work in, and how do you know that you've got a sustainable system? How do you know you've got the best system that you can get on that particular field? So if we'll start with Ed on that one.
Okay. I kind of look at sustainability, and sustainable is a word that applies to some aspects of what I'm trying to do and not others. So when it comes to soils and improving soils, I don't want to sustain, in most cases, what we've currently got. I want to improve them, which is where the term regenerate comes from. Uh-huh. But then once I've done that, then in theory, being able to maintain a level of yield that is sustainable. In other words, you're producing those crops in a fashion that is sustainable. So you're reducing your reliance on inputs, you're minimizing your effect on the environment, and you're producing a crop which is sustaining the stock that you're raising off it, or providing healthy food for humans that are consuming it. That's then where the sustainability bit kicks in. So we're regenerating soils to be able to produce sustainable crops or produce crops in a sustainable way. Did that answer the question?
Yeah. I mean, that is a point. I mean, part of this does depend on where your starting point is. If you have a particularly good, if you're lucky enough that your soils have been maintained very well in the last 100 years, and your starting point is from a very good position, then maybe what you're looking at is to sustain. But as we know, many of the soils have been degraded over the many years, and so it is regeneration of those soils that is needed. So Dick, do you have any thoughts on this particular area?
Schoolboy error. Let's turn my mic on. For me, it really starts with, for the majority of growers, it starts with the basic nuts and bolts of what you're looking at in measuring the soil. I mean, I agree with what's been said that soil is your basic measure, and if you're not taking measurements in your soil so you can see where the improvements are coming from, and if you don't really understand in your own mind what is an improvement in soil management, that we're going to have a struggle. And for many growers, it's simply a case of pick out the big wins, and often there's just too many cases of going to the fine detail of what might be considered a sustainable system or really healthy soil. and you're missing the really basic nuts and bolts. So for me, it would be, start with the basic nuts and bolts of understand what your soil is doing, have a proper inspection of it. It's something called a spade. Use it frequently. And increasingly, if you can, spend a day with a mini digger, probably one of the best things you'll do in the farming year, to be perfectly honest. Get out with a mini digger and go around, dig some holes and see what's actually going on in your soil. Ideally, you would do that mid-season rather than middle of the summer when the combine's gone through and the ground is really bone dry. I mean, that's where it really comes back to the basic nuts and bolts, is that most farmers will go and inspect their soil, make a decision around how they'll manage it when the crop is cleared, combine's gone through, it's the middle of the summer, the crop has sucked all the water out of the soil, and what they're faced with, particularly if there's any clay in it, they're faced with a very hard, dry soil, it's very easy to assume that what you're looking at is compaction rather than just dry clay soil. So looking at things at the right time is so important, and understanding what parameters you're looking to measure. Again, worms have been mentioned. Fantastic measure of certainly the biological status of your soil. One of the top predators, if you like, in your soil. If you've got plenty of worms, you've generally got plenty of microbiology supporting that population of worms. But if you're inspecting worms along with other soil inspection in the middle of the summer, well, the worms aren't going to be in the top of the soil. They've gone to depth because it's too dry in the top. So it's just getting a basic understanding of when you should be looking at things, what you're actually looking for, what the numbers mean when you've done either a VEST test or a worm count or an infiltration test. What do they mean? What do you need to adjust, and how do you best adjust it? For me, that would be the starting point, and really everything that underpins a sustainable system. Are you making sustainable decisions about the way you manage your soil and what do you expect to produce from it? And then you've got the cover cropping issue of being able to fill gaps in the rotation. That's where we certainly see what they can do for us. Is again, legumes have been mentioned. We have varying levels of legumes within our cover crops, but growers don't want to go legumes because it's difficult unless you're in a forage situation. It's very difficult to make good money from growing legumes. I'd agree, some growers do it very well, but a lot of growers dip in and out of legumes, don't do it desperately well. The soil's not ready for the legume, so is the rhizobium there to support that occasional population of peas or beans? These are all questions you need to think about. If they don't work on my farm, why not? There has to be a reason for it, because they should grow everywhere. And we can, but for a lot of growers, we can fill that gap with a cover crop species mix.
Yeah, I mean, certainly within the cover crops system as well, the further north you're going, it's fitting that in with the growing system season as well, isn't it?
It is if you look at cover crops in the normal run of things, but I think this is where we need to just get very open-minded. So, we would tell everybody to grow cover crops from the middle of August, and I fully appreciate that the further north you go, having ground clear in August is highly unlikely. Combines don't roll till September, and then it gets turned straight round into another crop. So, okay, can we look at growing companion plants? So, oilseed rape is being grown with a companion plant because there's a perceived need to do that with cabbage stem flea beetle. So that's the driver for doing it, to try and dilute the pressure of cabbage stem flea beetle. But intrinsically what we're doing is actually improving the condition of the soil in which that brassica crop is growing, and benefiting that brassica crop from sharing of phosphate and nitrogen between species. And there's no reason why we can't do that with a crop of wheat or crop of barley. We just need to think about which plants we put in. Effectively, we're picking our own weed population rather than waiting to see what we get. And as long as we pick weeds that either get winter killed, like buckwheat or some of the clovers, or are gathered up by a standard herbicide we might use, I think I've dropped out again.
Oh, no, you're still there. You just blurred for a moment.
Right. Okay.
Okay, that's great, Dick. Christine, would you like to have a?
Wow, there's so many threads now going in my head with all these things people are saying. But I guess, sustainability, profitability for a start, and the idea that you can either maintain, well, at the very least, maintain soil quality, or in an ideal world to improve that in some way. And I think some of our long-term experiments that we have at Craveston, Aberdeen, show this in different ways. So we've got an experiment where for 60 years we've maintained soil pH at different pHs from 4.5 up to 7.5. And I think I think it was Dick was talking about getting the basics right. We'll get the pH right for a start for the right crop, because alongside getting the pH comes the soil biology. And we've now got some very nice data that shows that very elegantly. That a relatively small shift in pH in the wrong direction can knock the whole system out of kilter. So for sure, it's about getting the pH right. I think you asked the question, how do we know when we've got there? And I would say I'm not sure we're ever going to get there, because we need to the argument is for continuously improving the system, and at different times we will want systems to deliver different things.
Yeah.
And part of that is about a changing climate and being able to produce systems which are resilient to extreme events would be one argument. I guess the other thing I wanted to pick up on was just what Dick was saying there about what he was calling sort of companion plants, and the idea that the right cover crop for the right situation. What is it that you want that cover crop to deliver? And in many cases, the further north you get, undersowing in a traditional sense might be the only way to establish those covers in time. And then you get to the idea of saying, well, if you've got an all arable system, what's the opportunity for maybe bringing some livestock into that system to improve the soil quality? So putting something in undersown that you can then maybe graze off with sheep in the winter. And we're looking at in an EU project, sort of linking up arable farmers and livestock farmers. So perhaps moving sheep into a system, and we're also looking at sheep grazing winter cereals. How can we develop more integrated systems that give us more resilience to climate change, but also in a way share the risk of doing different things?
Yeah. I'm glad you brought in the point about resilience, because to me that's what a sustainable system is about. It's making a system. It doesn't necessarily have to stay the same all the time, but it's resilient to what the climate throws at it, and it allows you to bring both not damage the soil in the process, but also have that sustainability as far as being able to produce the crop that you need to make the farm run on a financial basis. So we've got some questions in the question and answer. So the first one was from Fiona Burnett, which says, what practical options would you advise to get more legumes in the rotations, and are there any new legume options that will grow reliably in Scottish conditions? So Pete's obviously going to have a kind of thought on that. Does anybody else? Before I let you go first?
I'm sure Christy and I would be equally happy to field that one. It's a good question. More legumes and nutrition. From my point of view, the issues of best practice aside and getting your soil right,
thanks very much for everyone today, and we're not too far over.
Outside the farm gate. I personally feel that perhaps pull is more important than push, and that with
more greater detail.
If we had, for example,
and again, at the bottom of the Q&A tab is the link to the basis and enrollment points. So thanks very much for everyone today. We're not too far over time, so we'll leave it there. Okay, thank you.
With the infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, we could create more pool. There's certainly huge demand there, obviously, from the animal feed people. There's huge demand from aquaculture, enormous demand from aquaculture. Not to mention the growing food markets that are emerging, and they're also lucrative. So to me, I'm going to ignore the cropping environment for the moment. There's a lot I could say about that too, but I'm going to emphasise this desperate need. I actually think there was an article in the Courier just this week emphasising that the fact that we have this void in terms of capability outside the farm gate to create that pool. Now, with regard to novel legumes, there's a few that we could do. From a forage point of view, I know that there's been some nice results with Lucerne, I believe, for SRUC, which are a really promising crop. In a good year, I guess it can be harvested 3 times or more a year. Some terrific biomass is being taken off, and it's got a great amino acid complement as well. In terms of the legume side, the grain legume side, talk about climate change. A few years ago, we had a grain legume crop. We had a soybean crop, a grain soybean crop in Dundee. That was the exceptionally warm year, 2018, I think it was. But we can routinely grow lentils into crop with barley. There are common bean types that have emerged from England. I've not trialled them in Scotland yet, but I wouldn't mind giving them a go. But it's important, of course, that breeding keeps moving. And as new varieties emerge, especially the 000 soybean types and whatnot, I'd be curious to see what might be achieved with a dedicated breeding programme for Scotland. But also that's true for the forage legumes as well. It's maybe a question for Hutchinsons more generally. I'm curious what breeding is going on, for forage legumes to make them perhaps better suited to a Scottish climate. I'm not too sure. But Christine, maybe you want to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. I think again, it's thinking about how we can diversify the system, and many of these more novel grain legumes. I mean, things like lentils are great, but they don't stand up on their own. They're flat on the ground, so you can combine them with a cereal. And in the same way, most of the grain legumes go really well in an intercropping type situation, and you end up with the cereal having an enhanced protein content over what that cereal would have had grown alone. And although we may not be always able to ripen an intercrop through to harvest, as an arable silage, it works well. So I think again, it's about what are the options? How can we diversify the system? And I think it's the same on the forage legume side. That white clover is a great crop, but we've been growing that for a long time. Red clover, the newer varieties of red clover are becoming much more persistent, which has been a real issue with red clover. But also there are sort of more minor species like Alsiki clover, and there's a variety of other species which we can start to put into systems. One of our long-term experiments, we've actually been undersowing white clover into all the arable crops apart from potatoes, but just sticking at a low seed rate, putting white clover into all the cereals and just trying to trickle feed some nitrogen, but you get some additional benefit there of ground cover and the biodiversity aspect. So it is about new varieties and breeding, but it's also I think it's also about being a little bit imaginative about how we can combine, how we can sort of put together different crop combinations. And Paul might want to add in on the lucerne side. I don't know.
Yes, I mean we've had some lucerne growing. We fed it out. Again, I think what I would say with a lot of both legumes and more or less cropped species and crops that are grown at the moment, it's looking at the conditions that they need, satisfying those conditions, and making sure that you give the crop the best start, really, and the best conditions to grow. It's no use growing lucerne in very wet conditions, because we know that already, so don't try that straight away. I mean, if I'm holding my hands up, a farm manager did try it on one of his wetter fields, and it didn't work very well, so he then had to move it to a drier field where it started growing pretty well then, and we did get the the 3 cuts a year from that. But also we had to look at the pH and make sure the pH was right, because we know it needs a more neutral pH. So I think it's considering all these different issues and looking at them, and in some ways the best thing I've seen is talking to people who've grown this well and listening to the it might be even, anecdotal experience. It doesn't always have to come from experimental work, but how they've succeeded in growing a good crop of that. And that goes for, your bean species, especially in wet years. What you're going to do with that? Are you going to dry the crop out to harvest it? So it's thinking about the conditions you've got that crop growing in, and again, how it affects the soil. I mean, it is important, these rotations, what it's doing to the soil. And I was thinking about this the other day, where we were saying about the crop that particular year. Yes, you're interested in the yield and how much you're getting out of that, but also what is that adding to the rotation in total as well. It may be beneficial to the next year after that residual end, maybe help you reduce your fertilizer input or create a better crop of the wheat that you may be growing the next year. So just looking at that 1 year and thinking, oh, well, the yield was adequate, but I might not do this again. It's thinking about how it fits into the whole rotation there as well. I think you're on mute, Tracy.
Yeah, you're on mute, Tracy.
I was cutting it off because there was a lot of noise in the background. I was just wondering whether Ed or Dick wanted to pick up on Pete's query around the breeding.
I haven't got necessarily anything to add on breeding, but what I would say is that I'm always careful of making broad brush recommendations on something like this, because every farm and every field is very different. But I think between us there, we've just listed probably 10, 12 different ways of integrating legumes into your system, whether it be forage-based, arable, companion crops, intercrops, cash crops of legumes. One of those ways will work on your farm. You've just got to work out which one it is, and I can't give broad brush recommendations here, but I guarantee you one of them will work. It's just a case of finding out what suits your soil type, what suits your system, and actually working out whether there's opportunities actually within your system. Because if you're running into problems rotationally, maybe you need to start making room in the rotation for legumes, because you've got you need to break up pest or disease cycles or weed cycles. So actually a cash crop of legumes, while it doesn't necessarily look particularly attractive on the face of it, the rotational benefits are huge. And I think it's important to look at the rotational value of it, both financially and agronomically, rather than looking at it as an individual year and an individual crop.
I think there's a question from Adrian in the question and answer, actually, that would be quite a good follow on from that. He's written, pests and pathogen carryover, particularly when using diverse cover crops, seems to be an increasing potential problem for crop sequences. How big of an issue is it in practice?
Well, whilst I'm at it, I'll just come back on that one. Yeah, I think that's almost a bit of a contradiction to me, that question, because we are using diverse cover crops to combat pest and pathogen issues. So personally, and as a business, we use 6-8 way cover crop species, so that you're not. We run into pest and pathogen issues because we grow monocrops. So if you're growing monocrops or two-way mixes of cover crop species, then it's highly likely that you'll get pest and pathogen carryover. If you're growing a diverse mix, you're massively reducing the overall risk of any individual issues associated with one particular species. And to answer this sort of the last bit of the question, how big an issue is it in practice? It's not, to date. Of a fair bit of experience between the two of us in using cover crops now, and you only tend to get the issues when you're using single or two-way mixes of cover crops rather than diverse cover crop mixes.
Does anybody else have any kind of thoughts on experience in that kind of zone?
I haven't, but I'm noticing there's a question there from Doug Christie, who I know.
I was just about to go to that one.
Reasonably well, because I think what we're talking about here relates, to an approach I know that Doug uses. He's very, very soil focused with his operations. I think I'm speaking for him. I think, but I'm speaking for him and probably other farmers as well. I think they're aware that the damage that excess nitrogen addition can do. So they're very careful to manage their additions to the soil well. And they're not productionist focused. They're about that. Also, you need yield, but that really needs tempered with a new approach. He talked about not chasing the red queen, and I think he's quite right. The operation should be gross margin focused, not necessarily production focused. So if you can, use these natural solutions to lower inputs, your yield may reduce, but so what if your gross margins are increasing? And also you're regenerating critically, the critical aspect, you're regenerating your soils in the process. So definitely we need to get away from being productionists and moving towards the preservation, restoration of natural capital for sure. And I think that's going to be increasingly important going forward. I expect carbon credit schemes are going to be an increasing part of how farms might look at their farm income going forward.
I mean, from a personal point of view, I can follow on from that as well, that from the evidence that we've had in some of the trials that's actually Doug has hosted for us, and one's done on the Hutton site, where in some of the direct drill sites, comparing them with inversion plough sites, we've shown that different varieties are particularly adapted to one or the other. So while we've been breeding for very much the inversion plough systems, we're not necessarily breeding for these systems where you're using direct drill and integrated management systems. And so there's an opportunity there to still raise the yields within those systems and help that bottom line by breeding for those systems, particularly.
But I think if I can come in on that one, Tracy, I think you're right. It's about it's the right plant for the right situation in that sense. But I think that also applies to the way in which we use land in general, and particularly, in Scotland, we've got a lot of land that you might consider marginal to mainline arable production, but that doesn't mean we can't do useful things with it. And looking at the kind of alternative crops that we could be growing on some of the less good land that are, able to deal with wet conditions or cold conditions or acid conditions, and looking at how we bring those into developing profitable cropping systems, I think is really important.
I would encourage everybody to read that book, Chasing the Red Queen. Very good, real eye-opener. Makes you question a lot about what we've done for the last however many years and what we're going to do going forward. But yeah, I think that era has definitely had its day, and I think it has had for a while, to be honest. And it's high time we start looking at coming up to solutions to our problems that are based on good farming practice rather than waiting for the next silver bullet.
Has anybody else got any follow-on from that? Dick, did you have any thoughts on?
Well, I mean, I'd alliterate what everybody else has said, but I think again, for me, it just comes back to, and particularly when you think about things like Chasing the Red Queen, it just makes you think about, if I have a weed problem, why do I have a weed problem? Instead of saying I have a weed problem, how do I control that weed problem with something out of a can? Generally, it's what is causing that weed. What am I doing in my system that is growing that weed? Can I do something in my system that no longer encourages that weed to grow? So if I don't grow it, I don't have to control it with a pesticidal input. So, and we can do that across a whole range of things, whether it's diseases, soil issues, erosion, weeds. It's just thinking about it in a different way, and always we can incorporate crops, as Ed said. We just said about 8, 9 different ways that we might be able to utilise legumes within a rotation. And one of the things we need to stop doing is always thinking about the addition of something must have a financial payback in terms of being measured in yield. It may have a fantastic payback within the rotation, as Paul suggested, within the rotation, which is not obvious in year 1 or year 2. Or actually is obvious at all, even during the rotation, if it's not being measured. If the only measure is a yield increase, we often miss some key issues that we can address by relay cropping or catch cropping or cover cropping or companion cropping. And we've just got to open our minds to be more flexible in what we do and why we include things. Maybe we don't always grow a crop to harvest it. It's just part of the rotational, particularly companion plants. We don't have to harvest those as well. We can still use a herbicide and take them out at the appropriate time once they've done the good bit throughout of their growing cycle. And I back up exactly what Ed said around this. We always hear about this problem within the rotation of having cover crops in a multi-species, etc., etc. And I would continue to say, well, please show me the problems. People are assuming, based on conventional agricultural thinking, that if you grow a legume in the rotation other than a pea or a bean crop that you're going to grow for cash, there will be this carryover of disease or pest problems. And we just don't see that. What we do see actually is an advantage. And in our view, it's because a little bit of legume within the cover crop all the way through the rotation is maintaining that rhizobium population that then engages with the pea or bean that you put in the ground straight away, rather than I haven't grown a legume for 8 years and I suddenly expect a crop of peas to have enough rhizobium to just get on with it and give me top yield. And it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much about thinking much more on this sort of long-term kind of scales rather than just what's happening on that particular year. Yeah. I think we've got 8 minutes left, so I think we'll just add. We've got a couple more questions appeared in the thing, and one is one of the ones that is quite challenging when people think about sustainable rotations, which is, can potatoes be part of a sustainable rotation?
If I had a fiver for every time I've been asked that question. I'll go very quickly. Yes is the answer. Clearly, it's a crop that involves a lot of soil movement because we haven't yet worked out how to harvest them particularly, but also establish them without moving a lot of soil. We can start by not growing them every 3 years, grow them every 8. We can grow cover crops before them, and we can do everything else across the rest of the rotation that is good for soil, so that you're building resilience into that soil, so that when you come through and grow and harvest potatoes, your soils have that just bounce back ability, rather than taking sort of no steps forward and then 2 steps back when you come and grow potatoes. Just taking 3 steps forward across the rest of the rotation and maybe only 2 or 1 back. So over time, you will be able to improve your soils and grow potatoes sustainably. But it's attention to detail. Okay, you're never going to reach the dizzy heights of the worlds of fully regen and no-till and all that wonderful stuff you hear about. But you can definitely grow potatoes sustainably. It's just looking at it with some real attention to detail.
I would agree with that as well. I think that's really important, because you're thinking of the whole rotation there and what you can do within that rotation to keep your soil and soil health as sustainable as possible. With having the potatoes there, if you're just saying no, you can't, then you don't get potatoes. So I think putting that into the rotation and thinking about the whole rotation and the soil quality within there is really important and the right way forward for that.
I think it's probably about time we start wrapping up now. But I've got one comment from Doug Christie, which is quite interesting. He said, not a question, but in his experience, The benefits of cover crops within the rotation far outweigh the disadvantage. Nature does not bear soil, which I think is a nice kind of roundup. So I think if we just go around the table and just each of you just give your final thoughts of what we've discussed, and then we'll wrap up. So shall we start with Paul then, since we started with you in the first one?
Right. Thanks for that. No. I mean, it's been, I think, a really useful discussion, this, and I think getting your basics right, thinking about what you need to do, monitoring, I think, is so important. You can't manage without monitoring, so you need to know what the state of your soil is, the state of your crop rotations before you start doing anything major to that. Make sure everything's right. And again, one of my just personal things, as Christine brought up, is the pH. It seems to get neglected a lot, so much with everybody concentrating more on the NP and K and micronutrients or whatever. But I do think getting the right pH is really, really important.
Okay, thank you. Christine?
I think if I was going to add something very short to what Paul says, I would pick on the phrase diversity matters in lots of different ways, in lots of aspects of life. But, around the idea that, introducing diversity to systems does a whole range of things. We've talked about the risk spreading. We've talked about the rotations. We've talked about, the benefits of residues of different crops and the impact that's going to have on biodiversity. So, yeah, diversity matters would be it from me.
And looking in all the different ways you can introduce that diversity, as many people have mentioned this afternoon. So, Pete?
Thanks, Tracy. Yes, thanks to my fellow panellists for a nice discussion. If I was to emphasise anything briefly, I would like to see more breeding, of crops for the Scottish climate. Whether that's cover crops, I'd like to see a Scottish crop breeding industry reinvigorated, to be frank. If we can ally that to best practice, and I'd say with respect to that breeding of crops, that's with a view to not yield, that's with a view to the regenerative traits of crops. I think sometimes we get too busy dealing with the disease that we forget about dealing with the causes of the disease. When we see various challenges in agriculture, and with best practice and the right plant types in place, I hope there would be changes in the value chain to make sure that the pool that's generated from the those value chains outside the farm gate, that they pool these more sustainable products when they are realised. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Pete. Ed?
Yeah, I think I'll just finish by coming back on a point I was going to make earlier, actually, around the measurements thing. I think if you focus on one specific measurement, you can very quickly pull it to pieces and find holes in it. Even something as simple as a worm count. It's great, but if you looked at it in detail, there's flaws. So what I would say to somebody is do a range of measurements. Look at all different aspects, but not just of measuring soil, but actually measuring the performance of your business. So look at how your crops are doing in terms of yield, but also margins. Most importantly, what you're doing profitable? And try and do that at the start of doing something different, and then try and do it as you go along. But don't focus on one particular measurement, because it's the combination of all of them that shows you're successful. Not focusing on one particular aspect. But thanks for everybody's time. Really good discussion.
Thanks, Ed. And Dick?
Not to add to everything everybody else has said, because it's being last is quite difficult. I think just because you're in Scotland and it's further north, and your timings are all more condensed in terms of your climatic conditions, is don't simply think that you can't. You can always do it. There is, You just have to find a way of incorporating it. So for you, hearing growers down south talking about sowing cover crops in early August, obviously pretty much a non-starter for the majority of you, but absolutely no reason why you can't consider understories of cover crop or intersowing of cover crop. Expand your mind in terms of what a cover crop is. As again has been said, diversity really is all that it's about. So if you grow commercial oats and wheat and barley and grass, don't grow oats as a cover crop. And just because they're black oats doesn't make them any different to the other cereals that you're growing. Make sure that you're doing something that is diversely different to what you've already got in your rotation. Take the opportunity to do something completely different, and also think along the same lines to do other things throughout your business completely differently. Don't commit the whole farm to it. Play around in small areas until you're confident in what you're doing and see what works, because it won't work for everybody everywhere. The same thing, but be open-minded. If you've got a problem, really think about how you overcome that problem in a number of diverse ways. So diverse thinking, diverse input, diverse plants really would be my closing thoughts.
Great. So, well, thank you very much all for a really nice chat. Covered lots of different areas. I think I'd sum up is that diversification, both in your what you look at to track how far you're getting, are you going in the right direction, and looking at those margins rather than just purely yield. And thank you very much, and thank you very much for everybody who joined us.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks.